Good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to the afternoon session here in Women in Media Ballybunion. After all the heated debate and serious topics of this morning, I think you have a nice hour ahead here as we talk about books and various other things. Our guest this afternoon is one of Ireland's best-known voices, as one of the presenters of RTÉ Radio 1's Morning Ireland, as one of our most established journalists and broadcasters. But in recent years, she has let loose her creative side, I guess, and has published 3 books and has just given birth to the 4th one, which we're going to talk about. So will you give a big Ballybunion welcome, please, to Rachael. Rachael, I have to ask you, because every single session, I think, up until now, the contributors have established their Kerry or preferably Ballybunion credentials, which seems to be very important. I think you have, luckily, some connection.
I have. My Aunt Libby has a mobile home in In fact, she's had it since the early 1970s. I should say it's been through several incarnations, and I should also say that my Aunt Libby is 90, but she still spends every summer here. And about 5 years ago, there was a bad storm, and the mobile home pretty much got blown into the sea, you know, off the cliffs and into the sea, and everybody thought, oh, that's the end of that now. Anyway, didn't she get a new mobile home, bigger and better than ever? So there's absolutely no way they're going to get rid of her. Now, my uncle also has a place in the same park, as does one of Libby's sons. So it's very much a family business. And we used to come here, actually, gosh, not on extended holidays, but certainly for like a couple of nights, nearly every year when I was a child, so I know it well.
And the sun always shone, presumably.
This is the first time I've seen the sun shine today.
So the secret to a long life like your Auntie Libby is to get a mobile home in Ballybunion.
I think so.
Taking notes
actually.
on that.
Yeah.
That's going to be on my to-do list. Rachael, you're kind of, I want to talk to you about the 2 separate elements of yourself in your life. I think your journalism, and then we'll talk a little bit about your books and your writing and your stories and all the rest of it. But if we can start with talking about your journalism. Was journalism something you always wanted to do?
Yes, pretty much, and I'm not sure why. I was one of those nerdy children who likes reading the paper, and, you know, my mother would have had music on the radio, and, you know, when I was 12, I would have been saying, will you turn it over to Radio 1 there, can we get the news? Like, I was you know, a terror. And in fact, so much
Could you just imagine, parents nowadays would be so thrilled if any of your children said, can we listen to the news? I spent my life trying to batter them into, like, being aware of what's going on. What?
And in fact, so much so that by the time I was 15 or 16, I'm from Shannon, and she worked in a factory in Shannon where her boss got the Irish Times, which wouldn't have been altogether common at the time.
Yeah.
You know, they would have had about 3 copies of it in the newsagents, and she used to bring me home Austin's Irish Times every day. I love her, so she was only encouraging me really. But at school, again, it wasn't really a thing that you did. I left school in the 1980s, and I remember going to the career guidance teacher. I mean, God love her, it was a large school. There were about 1,000 of us. There was probably 200 students doing the leaving cert. So you have, you know, everybody was kind of corralled. You'll do this, Tom, and you'll do that, Joe, and Mary, you'll do that. And I remember going into the home and saying, you know, I want to do journalism. And she kind of like looked at me and said, yes, but what do you really want to do? And I said, no, honestly, like I'm interested in journalism. And she said, well, there was a girl here a few years ago who did that, and she was very clever, and she didn't do very well. So really, I think of something else. I'm not making this up, that's what happened. So I think eventually poor Miss Mulholland, I beat her down, and I ended up doing communications in DCU. But even though that wasn't strictly speaking journalism, I think I always wanted to be a reporter. That was my thing. That's what I wanted to do.
And was it politics or kind of news in general that was appealing to you when you were young? I mean, did you have an interest in who was in power and all the machinations that goes on behind the scenes of political life?
I did, to a certain extent, yeah. And I think I was just fascinated by... I think if you want to be a journalist, you have to be interested in a lot of things, and you have to be a bit nosy. And I was always nosy, and I always had a lot of interest. And I think, as well, if you were growing up in the 1980s, it was a time of, very different time to now, obviously, but a lot was happening, and there seemed to me to be a lot of news that affected women and young women in particular. And I suppose I remembered those times, and there were maybe the news seemed relevant to a teenage girl in those days in a way that maybe sometimes it doesn't now. I don't know, because I'm obviously not a teenager now, so it's harder to say, but I was interested. Yeah, I was interested in everything. It wasn't just politics. I remember, and like this sounds very sad, but I remember listening to Jim Fahey doing a report from the opening of Knock Airport, and I thought, that's the job I want. Now, what sort of life I had that I viewed the opening of Knock Airport as about as exciting and exotic as something could be, I don't know, but that's what I wanted.
Do you know, I remember the opening of Knock Airport as somebody who at that stage was working in, I think, the travel business, and it was miraculous, the fact that we had built an airport in what a lot of us considered to be a very strange location. So, you know, I can kind of understand that. So you came up to Dublin and you did your communication studies in DCU, was it? Mm-hmm. And then you went to Dublin, and you enjoyed being in Dublin. You thought this was where it's all happening, and I've arrived.
Yeah, I would have been very bright lights, big city, all right. At that, totally, I thought, this is it for me, I'm going to stay here now.
But then your dad was instrumental in bouncing you back to Clare.
He was. I mean, my dad would be of a generation, and you know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this, where he viewed education as grand up until a certain point, and then, you know, it was time you got a job.
I kind of guess where your dad's coming from.
Yeah, and I mean, I think he looks on nowadays and kind of sees, you know, young men and women of 24 and 25 still at college, and he's completely baffled. He just can't. And in fairness, that was very much from his own experience. He would have left school at 15. Most of his generation did. So there's kind of like, you know, he has a certain amount of patience with hanging around at college, but you know, the time comes where you have to get a job. So he heard there was a local radio station starting in Ennis, and he had me pestered, like, will you get in touch with them now? Will you give them a ring? Will you send them a letter or whatever? So I did. And I didn't really think I'd get the job. I was still at college, but I was very lucky I did get the job. And so I never really knew an unemployed day apart from a few weeks. So I did get the job. I discovered later that I only got the job because I was from Shannon, because the local radio station was starting up. And you know, if you've worked in local radio, it's very much, you kind of have to represent the whole county. So if somebody's winning a quiz, you know, it might be the turn of a particular part of the county or whatever. And if you're going to employ if you're going to employ somebody, well, like, you'd want to have a good spread, and they had nobody from the second largest town in the county. So hence I probably got a head start over people who were more qualified but weren't from Shannon.
I think you're probably being very modest. So you were. So how long did you spend with Clare FM, and also, did you fall in love with radio then? Because it's a very particular kind of medium, isn't it?
Totally. I absolutely loved it. I didn't, unfortunately, I probably didn't make the most of it, in the sense that I was still pining after my friends in Dublin. And it was a very big change. I was only 20, and it was a very big change all of a sudden to, even though I'm from Clare, I suppose in Shannon when I was growing up, we would have viewed ourselves as from the town and a bit apart, and we would have looked to Limerick really as our hinterland. And then I was in Ennis having to talk about places and report on places that I didn't know a lot about. And also, I think if you're just coming straight from 3 years at college, I remember, I was just thinking of this morning, the first time I went into a meeting of the county council. And at the time there were 32 councillors. So there were 30 men, 2 women. The top table, there would have been across the top, you know, the county secretary, the county manager, the chairman, etc. So that would have been 6 or 7 men. Then there was, between the councillors and the top table, there would have been the bench of reporters, and that was 4 men. And I was 20 years old. I remember walking into this and just kind of sitting there thinking, this is so bizarre. And I learned so much when I was in Clare FM, and if I had my time again, I'd probably spend longer there. I spent 1.5 years there, and I probably should have stayed longer, but I think at that age, you know, you do have itchy feet, you do want to move on, and so I did.
And you wanted to get back to the city?
I did, yeah.
So you got the job with RTE. Did you apply for that, or?
I first of all, I worked for about 6 months in PR. I worked for Bill O'Hurley, and who after 6 months brought me in and told me to go back to reporting. And he was really nice to me, and he said, you know, you can stay here or whatever. He said, but I don't really think it's for you, kid. And so, because PR has, it has a certain discipline about it, and I just didn't have that discipline. And, you know, as he would say, there's people paying me a lot of money now, and, you know, to look after their interests. And I'd be kind of laughing about them behind their backs and everything. So I really wasn't cut out for it. And then I got very lucky. I know people always say you know, you must have had pull, you must have known somebody. I didn't know anybody. There was an ad in the paper. I applied to it. News was expanding at the time, and I suppose that's one of the big differences between then and now. The output was expanding a lot, but actual jobs were expanding a lot, not, you know, actual paid jobs. And I applied for it, went through a couple of interviews, voice test and all of that, and much to my surprise I got a job.
And were you told from the get-go that you have, because you have, as I said, your voice is very recognisable. And as somebody whose radio alarm clock comes on to Morning Ireland, you're a very, I hope you don't find this patronising, but your voice is a very, not soft, but gentle, kind of zen kind of voice to wake up to in the morning. Do people tell you that from the get-go, that you've got a good voice for radio?
Probably. Now, my voice would have been, I think, you know, going back to then when I was in my early 20s, would have been a lot lighter.
Right.
Because I think your voice does deepen as you get older. But I suppose from my first job, yeah, people did kind of say, well, you sound the part anyway. You know, like, you might know what you're talking about, but you sound the part anyway. So yes, I did, you know, and that I did have that as an advantage, and I think if you're told that early on, then maybe you have a certain confidence about what you're doing that you wouldn't have otherwise. So I was helped in that regard, yeah.
And is having a very recognisable voice, because people probably wouldn't know you to see, because, you know, you're on radio, obviously.
Yeah.
But is having a very recognisable voice odd when you're out, that, you know, people don't recognise you until you start to speak, and then you can see people going, I know that voice, and then
I know it's lovely. It's very, very nice when people say, do I know you? Yeah. And then you keep on trying to go, and then there's a chance they'll say something like, do you read the news on 98 FM? But I know that has happened. But no, it's nice. Yeah, it's lovely, actually. It is nice. I mean, people say stuff like, oh God, you know, that they associate you with getting up in the morning, so there's a kind of certain, scariness about you. But, because I remember, I think Susan Daly's gone home now, but the journal.ie did a thing a couple of years back, and we loved it, called Ireland's Scariest Sounds, and one of them was the sig tune to Morning Ireland, because people associate it with the alarm clock. So, so that was so, yes, and it's nice.
Yeah. So, how long have you been with RTE now altogether?
Oh gosh, I'm tempted to lie, but I may as well tell the truth. 27 years next August.
So you've covered a lot of the biggest stories, obviously, that have been around. Can I ask you specifically about one of them? I know you were on duty at 9/11. Can you describe how it is when you were on the 5/7 Live at that stage, and that story started to break around lunchtime, as far as I can remember, because it was 9 o'clock in New York. It was kind of lunchtime-ish here. So by the time you went on air, you were aware of that this was a huge event, a huge story unfolding. Can you describe how that was in the newsroom that day?
Oh gosh, well, the first I knew about it, I was sitting in the canteen talking to a colleague, and Sean O'Rourke came over and said, what are you doing here? And I said, why? And he says, there's a plane after going into the World Trade Center. And I actually, you know, one of those, it took sort of 10 seconds or so. You go, like, are you serious, Sean? And then by the time I got back over to the office, about 30 seconds later, everything was going crazy. I remember we came on air early, and it's hard to describe, and it's hard to get this across now, the complete and utter sense of confusion. There was no precedent, there was no template, there was no knowledge of what this was about and what was happening and what might lie behind it. There was just complete and utter chaos, and I don't think I've ever come across anything else that was so chaotic, where you had no script, no experience, nothing to fall back on. It was just so different to anything else. And obviously we just stayed on air for hours and hours and hours and hours. And I'll never, I'll never forget it. And then over the course of that time, it gradually became apparent what was happening. But I think it's the same with any tragedy that's covered live like that. You're always concerned that you get the tone right, and you don't want to be phony either. I always find it irritating when I hear somebody obviously putting on their funeral voice, and because I find myself thinking, well, it's not your tragedy, so cool it a bit there. So, but at the same time, gosh, it's one of those things where it's hard to get the tone right, and it's hard as well in cases like that, when you don't know what's happening, to know how much you should say and how much you should hold back on. But it is one of those things. I will never, ever forget it. It was the most surreal because there was nothing like it. And I suppose since then there have been, not on the same scale, but there have been similar things have happened. But never again. It's hard to imagine what would have to happen. We were talking about this earlier, and you were saying, for us it was our JFK moment, that, it's very, if you were alive at that time, and if you were over the age of about 7 or 8, everybody does know where they were and what they were doing, down, like I said, to that tiny detail of that I was sitting in the canteen, shooting the breeze with somebody, and Sean O'Rourke came over going, go to work, kind of thing. And so I'll never forget it.
And how chaotic is it? I mean, are you watching feed that's coming in, video feed? Because I think that was one of the first stories that kind of broke live. That we were watching it in real time happening. So you're watching presumably live feed coming in from New York. And I presume at the same time then you're trying to get people on air who are on the ground, and experts and security analysts, and juggling the whole thing. It just seems to me to be almost an impossible task to do, and not to sensationalize it, and not to get kind of completely carried away. That's number one. And number two, I think, from somebody who, like most people I'm sure in this room, remembers it clearly, I found it very frightening. That this was an attack on America, and you suddenly were aware, what does this mean? What's the next thing that's going to happen? Were you aware of being frightened, or do you have to detach yourself completely from it?
I think to a large extent you do detach yourself. I think it's only afterwards, if you're, and that was at a certain remove, that was 3,000 miles away. I remember more so as a reporter being sent to things that were appallingly sad, that involved maybe something that nobody else might even remember at this stage, unless there was a family member involved, like a car crash where a number of young people are killed or whatever, and you do the job, and then afterwards you do go away and think, good Lord. So I think it's only afterwards that you tend to think about these things. And the other thing about live broadcasting is, the red light does change everything. You do get a certain burst of adrenaline, for want of a better word. I suppose that's the most accurate word. I remember reading not that long ago, and I think this is true, that there's a reason you never hear people sneeze on the radio, is that apparently your adrenaline is pitched at a certain level that makes it more difficult to sneeze.
Okay.
Yeah,
I always think when somebody says something like that, the next time you or I are on radio, that we're going to sneeze and everybody's going to go.
Can you remember the last time you heard somebody sneezing on the radio? And so there is I think your head just goes to a different place. Yeah.
Then, fast forward a few years on, because the other thing I wanted to ask you about was then in 2008, when everything came down around our ears and the Celtic Tiger expired rather dramatically. But again, as a punter, it seemed to me that for certainly 2 to 3 years after that, every single day the news was just so gloomy and so depressing, and was having such an impact on ordinary people's lives. As somebody who was working in news at that point, did you and your colleagues, was that tough? Was that a tough, long-winded kind of process of having to deal with that day in and day out? Were you aware of that? Were you aware of the fact that it was having a really depressing effect on people?
Yes, because I think it changed a lot. I think people became a lot more sceptical about a lot of things, including news, and including the job that journalists do. And that was probably no harm, as much as it can rankle sometimes when, you know, you find yourself you know, at the end of somebody's, at the wrong end of somebody's ire because they're not happy with how a job was done. It changed a lot, and I think I was very, very conscious of it. In the initial burst, I'm not talking so much 2008, and the bank guarantee and all that, that's one thing. It more so the 2010 events and the IMF coming in and the general sense that just everything was falling apart and nobody knew.
Did you interview Patrick O'Neill?
Yeah, and that was, you know, in terms of things that you'll never forget, that was definitely up there. That morning, it was myself and Cathal McQuillia, and we'd had this strange run on Morning Ireland where just a lot seemed. Obviously there was a lot happening in the country, but a lot seemed to happen on Morning Ireland over the course of a few weeks. There'd been the famous stroke infamous Brian Cowan interview in Galway, and at the Fianna Fáil party thinking, and which had led to all sorts of things that we didn't really foresee on the morning. And then this came a few weeks later, and it was myself and Cathal, and it was being reported that the IMF were based literally actually at the airport, and there was a lot of confusion, and perhaps, you know, we were getting very, very frustrated because you were told that, you know, you can only report what you're being told officially or whatever, but we felt that...
And what we were being told officially was we weren't getting a bailout.
Yeah, if you remember that the previous night there had been that now, again, infamous clip on the TV news of Dermot Ahern and Noel Dempsey saying, I haven't heard anything about any bailout. Do you hear anything about any bailout, Noel? And there was just this growing sense that everything was getting completely out of control. It also started to snow, if you remember, and there was just, it was again, to use that word, it was surreal. And I remember that morning, it was myself and Cathal, and we're in work from about 20 past, 5:30, and we're in the studio. Cathal was supposed to be doing the lead interview after 8 o'clock, which was with Eamon Ryan, who was in the government at the time. And he was obviously going to give the government line about, no, too early to say now, too early to say. And so then I was told that Patrick Honohan, the governor of the central bank, had called, and that I would be interviewing him basically in that slot, the 10 past 8 slot, because you know, that was just the way it had fallen. I had assumed that he was coming on to give the government line and that he would be saying exactly the same thing. And then he started talking, and it was apparent that what he was saying was completely at odds with the government line. And the producer, Brendan Fitzpatrick, who's very funny, and he's such a live wire, and he kept pressing the talk back to me going, will you just get him to say that again? And, because nobody believes it, will you just get him to say that again? And then he'd say, just one more time to be sure. And it was so, it was, gosh, it was the strangest morning. And that was the initial buzz. And then after that, there were, let's be honest, 2 or 3 years where most of the news was extraordinarily grim. Grim in a way, I think most of us who'd grown up in the 80s and thought that all of that was, that was behind us. That was another Ireland of another era when all your classmates left and families were torn apart and people, you know, went in on a Friday to be told that there wouldn't be a job on the Monday and all of that. So there was, but I think, to be fair, and I don't mean this can sound kind of schmaltzy, and I don't mean it that way. I do genuinely, because I've had some time to think about it now, is like, you do have to be conscious then of your own privilege as well, that you do still have a job. And it's very easy to be almost flippant about things after a while, to just, you know, take it for granted. And so you did kind of have to every so often just remind yourself that this was real people's lives. It wasn't just figures, and you know, this meant something to people. And I mean, the bizarre thing is, if you look at figures for that time for radio listenership and for TV news viewership, and maybe newspaper figures are the same, I don't know. They were as high as they have ever been in recent years, and I sometimes wonder now if that, for the media in general, if that was, you know, the last great time when everybody came together in that sense, and there was a sense of everybody following the one story, because people were just so desperate to get information.
We're all waiting for that chink of light, you know,
Yeah,
something positive to come out of it. The last kind of big story I suppose I really wanted to talk to you about, because we just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and I know again that was something that you reported on you went up, you were telling me earlier, to Northern Ireland on the Wednesday. Please tell people first of all, because you shattered all my illusions of being a, you know, high-profile journalist covering something like this. Tell people where you stayed for the duration that you were there covering the Good Friday Agreement.
in a caravan belonging to David Davenpower's next door neighbour. I reminded him of it actually a couple of weeks ago on Twitter, when people were commemorating with in all the sort of serious points that needed to be made about the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. What happened was, in fairness, that was only for one night. I did have a B&B in town, but on the Thursday night, everything was very tense, and there was this real sense of, will it happen, won't it happen? And again, the snow seems to be a recurring theme in all of these stories. It started to snow, and the weather was really grim, and I was a reporter at the time, and I'd been down at the gates of Stormont, because it was bizarre over the past couple of weeks to see, you know, in all the sort of coverage of the Good Friday Agreement, to see kind of the photo of Ian Paisley in a prominent way, when Ian Paisley was actually protesting at the gates at the time. He wasn't part of it. At that, I know he came on board later. But, so I had been down at that, and it was pretty hot and heavy, and then I got back, and you know, a couple of people had to stay, and Anya Lawler was presenting Morning Ireland, and there was this caravan that, in fairness to his foresight on it, DDP had reckoned that at some stage people might need the caravan, so he'd paid the neighbour a small stipend and had driven it in from the suburbs of Belfast to the car park at Castle Buildings in Stormont. So myself and Anya basically camped out in the caravan. I mean, it was either that or the floor of a porta-cabin. So it was, it was a nice caravan, but it wasn't nearly as nice as my aunt's mobile home down the road there. And I'll never forget that morning at 6 o'clock on the Friday morning. And it was myself and Anya, and there was another fellow who, God, left many years ago. I don't know where he is now. Barry Turley was his name. He was from Belfast. I think he subsequently worked for the SDLP. And there was the three of us in the caravan. And Donald Byrne, who was editing Morning Ireland at the time, knocked on the door and said, lads, you'd want to get up, Mitchell McLaughlin's given a press conference. So it was so bizarre that there was a Sinn Féin press conference, and all of a sudden people took this as, yes, that there is going to be a deal. And then politicians started to, it was April, so it was getting bright at 6-ish, but it wasn't, it was still quite dark, and politicians started to drift around. There were several porta-cabins where there were temporary radio studios and TV studios. Politicians started to drift around, and I remember there was a circle of people around John Hume, and he was talking about how Bill Clinton had been ringing them all, and then there was a sense that, oh, this is really, really going to happen. And it was one of those days that, I think in that case you kind of think, there was one of those days where there was an element of, and they pay me for this as well.
That's what I was just going to say, that you must
I was
feel
very,
really
very
privileged
fortunate
to be at the front seat for something like that.
When you are there for rare moments like that, gosh, yeah, it's an absolute privilege. Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, about Mo Mowlam, because again, like a lot of people, the fact that she seemed to have gotten written out of a lot of the commemorations in the last weeks, I found really depressing. And I know you and I think it was Philip Boucher-Hayes, was it? You did a radio documentary on Mo, and she was an amazing character.
Yeah, it's funny, we did that 20 years ago, or maybe 18 years ago, and in a couple of weeks ago, in the weekend leading up to the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, there was quite a bit in the papers, and I think there was a sense that, oh, there's somebody missing in a lot of these pictures, and the person who was missing was Mo Mowlam. And people started talking about this on social media in particular, more so I think than on radio or television or in the newspapers. And Philip sent me a text and said, do you have a copy of that documentary we made about Mo Molo? And it was mainly just archive clips, but because her clips were so wonderful and because she was such a wonderful interviewee, it was like we knew it was gold. And I said, gosh, I haven't heard that. Doubt you'll find that, Philip. Anyway, 10 minutes later, he managed to find it, put it onto SoundCloud, put it up on Twitter, and I lost count of the amounts of listens, the amounts of retweets and likes. And in the end, her stepdaughter got in touch with us. She'd come across it through social media, and she'd actually written a piece for The Guardian about how upsetting the family found it, that they felt she was being written out of history, and that, you know, if after only 20 years you're being written out of history, what hope is there that you will be there in 100 years' time? And that they were, I think, quite upset and angry about this. And it was so nice. So they got, the people who made the documentary, or rather were involved in another, they're filmmakers. They got in touch with us to say, "Oh, that's so brilliant," and it was really, really gratifying. And I mean, and it's funny for all that, you know, those of us who work in, God, I hate the term, the mainstream media, or old media is probably even worse. But anyway, traditional media, shall we say, sometimes give out about Twitter and Facebook and the like, and sometimes with good reason. That was just wonderful that day in getting that documentary out there again, and that immediately, and that people were able to listen to it in their own time if they wanted to.
It is very strange that she got written out, considering there was a feature film made about her as well. You know, that she was such a big... What did you make of her? As somebody who obviously met her and interviewed her, as a person, what did you make of her?
I mean, I would have met her a couple of times, but not enough to kind of know her in any real sense, to be honest. I thought she was extraordinary, and I suppose the thing that stands out for me now, and the thing you've got to remember is, A, she was very sick in all of that time, but B, she really wanted the job. We're very much in an era now where the job of Northern Ireland Secretary is kind of seen as... well, it's kind of seen as a punishment in many cases, isn't it? Or else if you're on the very, very junior rungs, that we might give you a go at that. But she was somebody who was a powerful person within the Labour Party, and she really, really wanted that job, when she probably could have had other jobs.
Yeah. Good old Mo Molo. And if anybody wants to listen to that, I'm sure you'll find it on a Google search very easily. That documentary.
Sure, I can give it a retweet. I mean, it's just a lovely old collection of archive, and even though it's only 20 years ago, in some ways it sounds like 1,000 years ago. You know that kind of thing. Oh God, there's your man. There. Yeah. And I found that very much so with younger colleagues actually. A couple of weeks ago at the anniversary. Well, no, it was very much. I remember it vaguely, and who was he type of thing.
I remember listening when I came home from school at lunch,
yeah. There was definitely a place for that.
Okay, we need to go on and talk about the other side of Rachael English, which is your creative side. And as I said in the introduction, you have written and published 3 books, and you have a 4th one which is just about to hit the shops, I think. Was creative writing also something that was always there, or is it something that is a more recent thing? And is part of the attraction for you, we've discussed your involvement with news and everything else, is it a lovely release to be able to then go into a make-believe world of your own invention?
Yes and no. To begin with, the first book, and it's probably no coincidence that the first book I wrote is the lightest, most escapist book that I have written, and that I also wrote it during the depths of the recession, because I think I did find it, I'd go home now and I'd sort of collapse into this world where it's basically, you know, attractive young people falling in love, like, you know, during the summertime in America, like how much better than that is what we're living through now. As time has gone on, yes, it was always something I wanted to do, but I think like many people who want to write when they're younger, or do write when they're younger, actually, as chance would have it, I know she's gone now, but I remember maybe 5 or 6 years ago, probably just before I started writing, reading a great piece by Fiona Looney, who said that she would love to have written plays when she was 21 or 22, but that actually, you know, she had to pay her rent. And there isn't, unless you are very, very successful, there isn't a lot of money in writing fiction. And I think most of us, you know, realise that we have to go out and, you know, and do something with ourselves. And there's also the extent then, I think you tend to, you lose confidence in your ability to do it. You think that writing fiction certainly is for people with a lot of qualifications, people whose family are that way inclined, people who are horrendously clever, and that's not you. So, you know, it's something that you will never do. And then maybe I got to a point where I thought, well, if I don't give this a try now, I'm never going to do it. And so I just kind of didn't tell anybody. I just sat at home and wrote until I had something that I kind of felt I wouldn't be totally mortified showing somebody. Apart from, like, my poor mother, like, used to be on the receiving end of, like, reams of paper in the post, and she was really nice, and I look back now at my first couple of efforts and think, oh gosh, what I put her through. But she's still great. She still reads everything as I'm going along. I mean, and she is of course she's my mother, so she's going to be nice, but she's kind of, I always know from her.
She would tell you probably if it was absolutely awful.
Well, no, she'd be very diplomatic. She'd say, I really like that character. In other words, she doesn't like the others. Or, it's a shame he died so early on. In other words, bring him back. And so she's very, very helpful like that. And the other thing as well is, this is hard to describe in a way, but I find that sometimes when I'm doing Morning Ireland, and I'm very lucky to do Morning Ireland, and I'm even luckier at the moment that because of the writing I'm able to do it part-time. When I'm writing, when you're doing Morning Ireland, you do kind of like 10 minutes is a long interview, and we would do relatively few interviews that are as long as 10 minutes. Most things are over in a 4 or 5 minute burst. And that's it, and you move on, and the next day's news is the next day's news. And that's the way it is and the way it should be, and that's fine. But this, writing fiction gives you an opportunity to just lose yourself in something. And you're with it. You're with it all the time. You're with it, you know, which can be annoying for other people in your life as well, because you do tend to get, you know, my poor husband saying to me, you're thinking of that book again, aren't you? And because you do tend to lose yourself in it. And also, I think, this probably wasn't the case with my first 2 books, but certainly with the last book that came out a year ago, The American Girl, which was about a young American woman who was sent to a mother and baby home in Ireland, and she became pregnant and was sent over. Her Irish-American family sent her back to Ireland in the 1960s. I felt that in that I felt I could contribute more in a way on that story, and that I could tell a story that was in some ways almost more, even though it was fiction, almost more truthful than what I could do in a 5-minute interview, if you know what I mean. I felt so engaged in it. I felt it really became very personal for me, even though obviously it was completely made up. None of these characters had existed. But I think I spent so long researching to try and find out what life would have been like for a young woman in that position, that it really, I became so engaged with it, more, like I said, more so than the first 2 books, that I really thought, oh, perhaps this is really how it's supposed to be if you find you're getting somewhere with writing.
Do you find, coming from a news background, that you have to stop do you tend to kind of get too into the research? Because I think there's a fine balance, isn't there, when you're writing fiction, between not getting too kind of bogged down in getting all the factual stuff, absolutely, because it is a work of fiction.
Yeah, that's so true, and there is a danger that I would start reading out facts and figures, and I think, no, this is terrible. This is not what people want at all. You have to show people what it was like, ideally, not, you know, not
statistics.
Yeah, not beat them over the head with statistics. So yes, it is. I mean, there are some things that the 2 have in common, but in that way they are completely different. You have to imagine yourself as somebody else.
Were your RTE colleagues surprised when they learned that you'd been a secret writer when your first book was published? Were they surprised?
Well, obviously I had to tell them a little bit before it was published. I did tell them on the day that a couple of days after I sold the book, and I hadn't said anything, I mean, I don't think I'm especially secretive, but there is an element, I think, in Ireland in particular, where, like, everybody has written half a book, and I didn't want to be the person going in boring on about my book. So I kind of kept it to myself, and then that's just became just the way it was. So apart from my mother, my husband, and a few friends who were very much like outside the RTE world, I didn't say anything to anybody about it, and then everything sort of came together very quickly, and I did have to say, like, you know, I did have to preface it with, lads, I promise I'm not making this up, but I've been writing this book, and wait till I tell you, it's going to be published. So, yes, they were stunned. Yeah, I got called Dark Horse more times than you know.
Because Irish people don't really like that. They don't really like you keeping things a secret and then coming out with it. You know, they kind of get suspicious of that, do you think? What else have you been hiding away, Rachel?
Yeah, I can understand. I can totally understand that now. Because if somebody did that to me, I'd be really annoyed with them.
Why didn't you tell us?
Yeah. But I was kind of doing this for a year and a half, and you don't want to appear like you can.
Do they then do the thing that I know other writers have told me happens with friends? Is they look for themselves in the book, like which one am I?
Yes, and in my first book, a friend of mine did kind of appear in it, and he, in a very exaggerated form, and we had, like, for about a year afterwards, he used to be joking to me about the solicitor's letters on the way. But other than that, no, because it's more that you take certain traits, or you take bits of people, but I really don't think, now maybe somebody might read one of them and say, that's me, but I haven't consciously done it with anybody, I really, really haven't.
Can you share with us, you mentioned The American Girl, which was the story, as you say, of an American girl from Boston who was sent back to Ireland because she was pregnant at 17.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what happened to you recently in connection with that, which I think is
very
surreal, again, to use that word again?
Yeah, this has only happened within the past few days, and I don't want to say too much about it because it does involve people's privacy, but I got an extraordinary message on Facebook the other day from a woman who had been given a link to the book by a friend of hers. I think she'd mentioned something and the friend had said, oh, like the book. And she said, what book? Anyway, when I wrote The American Girl, it was total fiction. I never imagined that in 1968 there could have been a young American woman from an Irish-American family who was to herself totally American, who becomes pregnant and whose rather straight-laced Irish family decide that she should be sent packing to Ireland to have the baby, and that essentially this will get her out of the way for a while. I was contacted by somebody during the week who's trying to trace a person on behalf of somebody else, and the story is in almost every detail the same. In fact, if anything, it's even sadder, because the only difference is it's the same year, 1968. A young American girl, in fact a year younger, Rose in the book is 17, this girl was 16, became pregnant in New York. Her teenage boyfriend, obviously the same age, her family sent her to Ireland. She went back like the character in the book, started school again, finished her education, and was told never talk about this, and she didn't. And
left the baby here in Ireland.
Left the baby here in Ireland to be adopted, exactly the same as in the book. She's now dead. She was killed at a tragically young age, and she had a son. She got married when she went back, like the woman in the book, had another family. In this case, she had a son. She was killed in her 30s in a car accident. Her son was only 5 at the time, and his father also died at a relatively young age. So he's grown up thinking that he's all alone in this world. Until recently, somebody in the wider family said, I think it's time you know that you actually have a sibling who was adopted in Ireland, who would be 50 about now. They reckon that this young woman gave birth in March or April 1968. And they have found another young woman who's obviously in her 60s now, who met her in Ireland, and who, unbelievably, referred to her in her diary at the time as the American Girl. It's just the parallels are, and it's, of course, I'm now thinking, like, were there other girls in a similar place? Because one of the reasons I wrote about it is, I suppose, is I was trying to imagine what it must have been like to have been in 1968 a teenage girl in America at the time of all that music and all that colour, and protests, the civil rights movement, hippies. Like, can you imagine what your world was like? And then can you imagine being sent to a mother and baby home in Ireland in 1968, and where you knew nobody, where you had no connections, where it was completely alien world, and she was a child. Like, the real life girl was 16, and they're not having any luck at the moment. I don't want to give any more details because they're not really, they don't want any publicity at the moment. They might do down the line, but I was sent pictures yesterday of the young woman in 1968, and it's honestly, and I'm not a particularly emotional person, but I was in town at the time, and I actually sat down in a Topshop on Henry Street, and they must have thought, what is wrong with your woman? Because I actually sat there and cried. I couldn't believe it when I saw her, because she, in the book, Rose is very beautiful, and that's one of the reasons that people remember her, apart from the fact that she was American, is the fact that people said, my gosh, but she was beautiful. This young woman was so beautiful. And then they also, the people involved also sent me a photograph of her several years later with her son when he was a little boy.
She's still beautiful.
And I was showing Barbara's photos. She's still, and she was really vibrant, and he's so happy with his mummy. And obviously she died a few years later, and it's just, and he now wants to try and find his sibling. He doesn't even know if he has a brother or a sister. He just knows they're about 50.
That must be really a straight, and I can see that you're still emotional talking about it, but I can imagine when you're writing a book, and I know this from talking to other writers, that you become so immersed in the story and in the character. So it's almost like as if your character in the book has become real.
Yeah, I never thought she was real. You invent somebody, and then you discover that
she was real.
She was real, and she was there. And the details are slightly different as to what happened to her when she came here, and obviously her story afterwards is very different. But in just so many ways, it's just like the woman who initially sent me the message, and who I've been in contact with since, said that like she couldn't sleep that night when she read your book. Her friend then sent her a link to the book, and she initially thought that I must have known this story, and that I had taken the young woman's story and fictionalised it. And I said, I've never heard it. So it's just talk about the just life, that overlap, that life is stranger than fiction. It's just extraordinary, isn't it?
I think that's an amazing story. Tell us a little bit about your new baby, which you have there, hot off the presses.
Yeah, literally, actually, because I only got it yesterday, and it's not out for another 10 days or so. It's called The Night of the Party, and it starts in 1982, during the big snow of 1982. Of course, when I was writing this, snow was just a distant memory. I know, I'm obsessed with snow. And of course, when I was writing this, snow was just a distant memory. And then no sooner had I the thing finished and edited, and of course, what do we get? But snow in a 1982 sort of style. So it starts in the big snow of 1982 with 4 young people. Tom, the main guy, is 12. And his 3 friends are 13, and they're in their first year at secondary school. And it's January 1982, and there's a party in Tom's house. And of course, Tom and his friends, as you do at that stage, at that age, see an opportunity to maybe steal a bottle of beer and a couple of cigarettes. So they go out the back, and the snow is tumbling down, and all the adults are doing adult things at the party. Anyway, the parish priest gets killed at the party. And you
didn't see that coming, she didn't.
And I suppose if this book is about anything, it's about how, and I was thinking again of a real life parallel to this last night, but actually not Father Nan Malloy, because it was something else that came into my head entirely. Was Mary Phelan died yesterday, who spent 20 years trying to find out what happened to her sister, Jojo Dollar. And like Josephine Pender, who died 6 months ago, who spent the same amount of time trying to find out what happened to her daughter, Fiona. And if this book is about anything, it's about how somebody can know something about a crime, but they mightn't talk, and they might convince themselves that they're doing the right thing by not talking. And so on the night of the party, Tom, who remember is only 12, he sees something, but he says nothing. And then he convinces himself that it's too late to talk, and then he convinces himself he'd be in trouble anyway and people wouldn't accept why he hadn't come forward at the time and his life would be ruined. And then he convinces himself that it's for the best. And it follows his life and the lives of the other 3 in the shed over the next 35 years. Now, they go off to lead very different lives, but they're always kind of drawn together by that night. And then 35 years later, his friend Connor, it was Tom and Connor and Tess and Nina in the shed, his friend Connor becomes convinced through a kind of series of events and a bit of a crisis in his own life that Tom is hiding something, and he tries to get the information out of him, and it's sort of, so it starts off, the first half of the book is in the 80s and 90s, and then the second half is in the present day.
Would you like to hear a little bit? Will we get Rachel to read a little bit? Okay, would you mind?
I'd love to. Now, the bit I'm going to read is not, because that sounds kind of dark, and the bit I'm going to read is actually quite light, and it's at the start of the book. It's on the day of the party, the eponymous night of the party. This is on the day of the party, and it's during the snow, and of course Tom and Connor, his best friend, have a day off school, so they're only delighted, and they're planning what they're going to do at the party that night. And they've invited the 2 girls into the shed, but they're not sure if the 2 girls will turn up, because the 2 girls are kind of a bit cooler than they are, so they're trying to impress the 2 girls. So anyway, this is in the first chapter, and like I said, it's quite light-hearted, but it's Tom and Connor are going off to play in the snow, and because they are only kids really, and I think especially back in those days at 12 or 13 you really only, like I remember myself at that age, like we were very unsophisticated entirely.
Yeah.
And so anyway, the two of them head off.
There's no pornography.
The 2 of them, no, I mean they kind of like out into the snow, lads. So the 2 of them, and they do on their way, they meet the poor priest, Father Galvin, who I should say is a good guy. And I want to make it clear that Father Galvin is actually a good guy. And they also meet Tess, one of the girls. So I think everybody who you hear referenced in this part comes to play a part later on in the book. There was chaos on Toomey's Hill, with everybody skittering around at different speeds. One of the O'Grady brothers was shoving fistfuls of snow down the back of the girls' coats. Or at least he was, until Liesl Talty, her mum was obsessed with the sound of music, gave him a slap across the face. Tom was impressed. He wouldn't dare hit an O'Grady. 2 other brothers whizzed past on election posters belonging to their Uncle Paddy, who represented the county in Dublin. Magella Sexton slid by on a wooden pallet. A 4th O'Grady said she'd get splinters in her backside, but he'd help her to remove them. Magella told him he'd never get that lucky. Some of the little kids from the new houses near the creamery were building a monster of a snowman. In the middle of it all, a stray dog ran around in circles, barking like he might have rabies. Toomey's wasn't much of a hill, but it was the best Kilmitten had to offer. For miles around, the land was flat. Great farming land, the adults said. They also said there was no money in farming these days, and that soon enough everybody would be living in Dublin or London, or New York, like Tom's sisters. Tom and Connor's progress had been slow. Connor had insisted on stopping every few steps and sticking out his tongue until a snowflake settled there. Tom's best friend was a long skinny malinx of a fellow with grey eyes and sandy hair. At the front, one bright red tuft stood up as though it belonged on someone else's head. Almost everybody liked Connor, but even if they didn't, they had to be nice because his mother was dead. His father, Flan Varley, was the local sergeant. Tom's dad maintained that this was the easiest job in Ireland. The last time there'd been a proper crime in the village, Queen Victoria had been in charge. On Main Street, they'd passed Father Galvin, who was wearing a huge furry hat like a Russian on the TV news. "Morning, boys," he called. "How's the day off school treating ye?" "Great, Father," said Tom. "Did you get a day off Mass as well?" Connor gave him a look that suggested this was a dumb question, but Father Galvin laughed. "That's a good one," he replied. "No, I'm afraid the Lord's work has got to continue. I'll be seeing you later, though. I hope your mam's not going to too much trouble." Father Galvin always came to the Crossings parties, and he always brought the same gift, a bag of lucky numbers and a box of Maltesers. He liked to drink a small paddy with a dash of water and no ice. Tom tried to remember everybody's favourite drink. This made it more likely that they'd slip him 50 pence or even £1. As priests went, Father Galvin was okay. His masses were short and he handed out hardly any penance, just a Hail Mary or two and a warning to behave yourself in future. The year before there'd been a visiting mission and the priest had given Tom 2 decades of the rosary. 2 decades. Tom wouldn't have minded, but he hadn't confessed all of his sins. He'd left out the part about looking at his dad's dirty magazines. The two might have stayed talking to the priest, only they saw Noel O'Grady coming. Father of the dreaded brothers, Mr. O'Grady was a total bore. Tom's dad said he always looked like he was one fried breakfast away from a heart attack. They were at the top of the hill, laying out the fertiliser bag they'd taken from Connor's shed, when a familiar voice rose up behind them. "Are we still on for tonight, boys?" It was Tess Fortune, smothered in a massive grey overcoat, a pink woolly hat pulled low over her green eyes. Tess was even thinner than Connor, so thin that one of the lads at school had called her a Cambodian. Without missing a beat, she'd given him a dirty look and said, "It's Kampuchea now, you ignoramus." Tess was tough. She had to be. She had no dad and people gossiped about her mam, saying she spent too much time in Pilkington's lounge. Her mam was younger than most parents. Oh, and she was beautiful. Not as beautiful, mind, as Tess's best friend, Nina Minogue, who was the best looking girl in Kilmitten. "Yep, we're definitely on," said Tom, as he glanced around for Nina. No sign. What if she didn't like the snow and had decided to stay at home tonight? He'd bet his life that the Minogue's house was good and warm. He couldn't imagine Nina seeing her breath when she got up in the morning or having to wipe the ice from the bedroom window with the sleeve of her pyjamas. Nina's father was a doctor, so he probably knew all about the importance of central heating. Of course, the Minogues were loaded, which must help with the heating and such. "You will be able to get away, won't you?" continued Tess. "I mean, won't your mum and dad want you to take people's coats and fetch drinks and that?" She was wearing long silvery earrings and the reflection from the snow made it look like they were shimmering and dancing against her face. She had a really small face. "It'll be fine," said Tom with a wave of one hand. He wished he'd taken off his gloves. You wouldn't catch the O'Grady brothers wearing gloves. Gloves were soft. "I'll have to hang around for a while, but once they've had a couple of drinks I'll be able to escape. Don't worry." "And I'll get out the window, no bother," said Connor, digging his hands deep into the pockets of his Christmas anorak. It was a genuine Lord Anthony with thick grey fur around the hood, not an imitation like Tom's. "Cool," said Tess as she twirled away. "I guess I'll see you later then." "And?" She turned back, a grin splitting her face. "Don't panic, Tom. Nina's coming too."
Okay, we've just a couple of minutes to throw it open to the floor. If anybody has a question they'd like to ask Rachael, shout. I think we can probably hear. Well, put your hand up first and shout. Has anybody got any questions? Yeah, great. Justine.
Would you like to be a full-time writer?
Yes, I think I would. Not right now, but yes.
Just in case anybody's taking notes or tweeting.
I know, not because I do have to be careful about that sometimes. I kind of have to, dim down the enthusiasm a bit when there are bosses about. Yes, I would one day, Justin. Yes, I really, really would. It doesn't pay very well. I've been very fortunate. The books have done well in Ireland. Like The American Girl did especially well. I suppose the subject matter helped, but it would be an incredibly selfish act to just kind of say I'm giving up my good day job entirely to go and do this. I would hope that I'd be able to do it one day, but I am, like I said earlier, I am kind of fortunate that at the moment I'm able to do my job part-time, and I know there aren't many jobs, even in journalism, that it's possible to do part-time. So I've been kind of fortunate in that. But yes, I would.
Great question. Anybody else? Yeah? Katie.
Hi, Rachel. I was just wondering, after years and years of having to be factually correct and get everything straight and just say what happened exactly the way it happened, is it a big leap, to then say stuff that didn't happen and is not true?
You see, but to me, when I'm writing it, it is true. Like, that's the thing is, and I was saying this to Barbara earlier, I mean, you feel like an awful fool. I remember when I wrote my first book, and I'd sit there and I'd weep. And you know, and I'd feel like such an awful fool. I think this is made up. Like, you know, you can't think, have I some sort of problem that I'm finding this really sad? When you know, it's nonsense. It's lies. These people don't exist. And then the more I met writers and the more I read, I discovered that actually it's perfectly normal to react like that. And people, I read, there's an American crime writer, Dennis Lehane, who I love, who wrote Shutter Island and Gone Baby Gone, and especially Mystic River, which I absolutely adore. And I read an interview with him not that long ago. In fact, I think he may have been at the Listowel Writers Festival a couple of years ago. And he said that, like, when he was writing Mystic River, which is, I don't know if you've read it, it is very, very, very sad, and it's about child abuse, that he was just an embarrassment, and that, you know, he just, you know, and this is, you know, a grown man who had been a social worker in a pretty, you know, hardcore area of Boston, so he had seen the tougher side of life, and that when he was writing this book, he would be crying like a small child, like not just one tear down the cheek, but actually sobbing over his character. And then I read somebody saying, and I think this is very true, if you don't get emotionally involved with them, how can you expect other people to do it? And the one other thing, one of the best pieces of advice, and I think this helps with making stuff up, is, I read this a few years ago, and I think it's so true, is to imagine your characters in situations that don't necessarily appear in the book. So to imagine, if you're writing about, like, one of these characters, to imagine what they would be like in a cafe, what would they order, what would they be like if they were going out for the night, how would they look at themselves in the mirror. And so it does get to the stage where if you passed one of them on the street, oh, you'd be perfectly normal to you. Like, it wouldn't occur to you as odd at all that you were saluting people who don't exist.
Who else do you read? Who else are your favourite authors?
Oh, gosh. My all-time favourite author is probably Anne Tyler. And she writes books about families, kind of maybe lower middle class life in Baltimore in the United States, where sometimes a lot happens in her books and sometimes not a huge amount happens. But they're so incredibly well written, not in a complex way, not as much as I admire experimental writers. I mean, she is the antithesis of that. I read somebody describing her writing recently as natural as breathing, but then I read an interview with her where everything she writes, she rewrites and rewrites and rewrites, maybe a dozen times. And she goes back over it again and again. But everything I've ever read of hers, I've been in it.
Yeah.
I've been in the house, I've been in the shop, they've been part of my life.
And when you're writing, how much do you chart out what's going to happen? I mean, I've interviewed writers who've said they literally take each chapter and they know they have to do, this has to happen and that has to happen and that has to happen. And they have it all laid out. And I've met other writers who kind of have, you know, the characters fairly sorted in their head. They know the beginning and they know where they need to go at the end. But they kind of leave it to happen in a more organic way as they're writing. And sometimes things happen that they hadn't anticipated were going to happen. Which camp would you fall into, or would you be somewhere in the middle?
I'd be in the middle, but towards the disorganised side, because I get impatient and I think I just want to write now. I don't want to plan. Having said that, I kind of have an idea of like that at certain points, maybe at 30,000 words, I would like this to be happening, or at 60,000 words, I would like that to be happening. But again, having said all of that, I met my editor a couple of weeks ago to discuss the next book, and she said to me, do you know, I think you'd really be better off if you did a bit more planning the next time. So Ciara, I will take your advice, and I will do a bit more planning next time, but it's perhaps a slightly different kind of book that it probably will involve. The structure is a bit more complicated, so probably, she's right, I should plan.
I could sit here and talk all afternoon. There's nothing nice than talking about, I think, about books and about writing and about characters and all the rest of it, especially with somebody as articulate as yourself, and with such a lovely voice.